The sound of children echoed across the playground as Brian Kelly climbed off the swing set. His sneakers scraped the dirt as he walked toward his bicycle, parked neatly against the fence. It was a humid afternoon in June 1991, and nothing appeared unusual in those final moments. Brian was only 7 years old. He had been playing tag with a group of classmates when he drifted away from them. Some children later recalled him stopping at the drinking fountain. Others remembered him standing near the fence, watching cars pass along the busy street that bordered the park. At 3:42 p.m., a mother picking up her own child saw Brian sitting on the grass, resting beside his bicycle. That was the last confirmed sighting. Minutes later, when his parents arrived to collect him, the space was empty. The bicycle remained exactly where it had been, untouched, leaning slightly against the chain-link fence. Police records would later note the disturbing details. No tire marks in the sand. No scuffle or struggle visible. The handlebars of the bicycle were still straight, the pedals clean, as if Brian had intended to return at any moment. But he never did. Within 15 minutes, panic spread. His mother, Linda, walked through the park calling his name. She checked the restrooms, the baseball field, and the shaded benches where parents often gathered. Other children shrugged, saying Brian had been right there just a moment ago. His father, Charles, sprinted across the parking lot, scanning rows of cars, convinced he would find his son hiding or playing a prank. When their search came up empty, a 911 call was placed at 4:05 p.m. The first patrol officer arrived at 4:12. He immediately noted the oddness of the scene. A missing child, broad daylight, and dozens of witnesses, yet no one had seen Brian leave the playground. The officer secured the area and contacted dispatch for additional units. Soon, squad cars blocked the nearby intersections, and officers walked shoulder to shoulder through the surrounding streets. Helicopters circled overhead, searching with infrared cameras. Still, the boy was nowhere to be found. Detectives later reconstructed those minutes with precision. The playground was busy but chaotic. Children running in all directions, parents distracted in conversations, cars pulling in and out of the lot. In that confusion, it was possible for someone to approach Brian without drawing attention. The first potential witness came from a teenager who had been skateboarding nearby. He told officers he saw a man in a blue pickup truck parked close to the playground fence. The truck was there when he arrived and gone when he left, roughly the same time Brian disappeared. But the description was vague, and no license plate was noted. Another mother recalled seeing Brian talking to someone near the fence. She thought nothing of it at the time, assuming it was another parent. When pressed, she could not remember the person's face, only a figure in light clothing who stood slightly outside the fence line. As the afternoon turned to evening, more than 40 officers were involved in the search. Neighbors were asked to open garages and sheds. Volunteers combed wooded areas while divers scanned retention ponds. Each passing hour made the situation more critical. Detectives noticed the absence of physical evidence. No clothing left behind, no scattered belongings, no footprints that suggested a struggle. Brian's school backpack was at home, leaving only the bicycle as the single piece of evidence. The eerie stillness of the scene troubled investigators from the beginning. Reporters soon arrived, their cameras capturing the frantic search. The image of Brian's bicycle, alone against the fence, became the haunting symbol of the case. That photograph would appear on evening newscasts across Jacksonville within hours. By 6:30 p.m., search dogs were deployed. Handlers walked them around the perimeter of the playground and into the nearby woods. The dogs picked up Brian's scent near the bicycle but quickly lost it outside the fence near the street. Investigators debated whether he had entered a vehicle at that spot. Every child in the playground was interviewed before being released home. Their statements repeated the same unsettling fact. Brian had been there one moment and gone the next. No one saw him leave. No one heard him cry out. As darkness settled over Jacksonville, floodlights illuminated the park. Officers refused to suspend the search. A command post was established at the community center, and detectives began creating a timeline down to the minute. Still, nothing emerged to explain the disappearance. At 9:00 p.m., with no trace of Brian, the case was officially classified as an abduction. The FBI was contacted, and the search radius expanded. For the Kelly family, the once ordinary day had turned into a nightmare. By nightfall, there was no trace of Brian Kelly. Brian Kelly was 7 years old, a second-grade student at Jefferson Elementary School in Jacksonville. Teachers remembered him as polite and eager to learn, a boy who always volunteered to read aloud in class. His handwriting was still uneven, but he took pride in every spelling test he passed. At home, Brian was the younger of 2 children. His sister Melissa was 12, and often teased him the way older siblings do. Their parents, Linda and Charles, worked hard to provide a stable home. Linda was a receptionist at a dental clinic, while Charles worked long shifts as a mechanic. Life was modest, but steady. Neighbors described Brian as active and friendly. He rode his bicycle through the neighborhood, played catch in the yard, and spent weekends drawing superheroes in crayon. He loved baseball, his glove already worn from hours of practice. His favorite team was the Atlanta Braves, and he often wore their cap pulled low over his eyes. His routine was predictable. School in the morning, homework at the kitchen table in the afternoon, and evenings spent in the small park near his home. The playground was his favorite place, a spot his parents considered safe, surrounded by familiar families. What made Brian's disappearance so devastating was the ordinariness of his life. There were no signs of conflict at home, no history of running away, and no reason to believe he would wander far. For the Kelly family, the loss came not from chaos, but from routine, in a place where they believed nothing could go wrong. Linda often said Brian's laughter filled the house, while Charles described him as determined, always wanting to do things on his own. That independence was celebrated as a part of his growing personality. But in June 1991, it became the haunting detail that deepened the tragedy. When investigators began piecing together his life, they found no hidden troubles, no secret struggles, nothing that could explain why he was chosen. He was an ordinary boy in every sense, and that was what unsettled the community most. If this could happen to Brian, it could happen to anyone. The next morning, his parents' faces were on every local news channel. The first hours after Brian Kelly vanished were chaotic. Police arrived quickly, establishing a perimeter around the playground. Children were gathered, parents questioned, and neighbors alerted. Officers moved through every corner of the park with flashlights, searching for any clue that might explain how a 7-year-old could disappear in plain sight. By dusk, search teams expanded into nearby streets. Officers knocked on doors, asking residents if they had seen a small boy in a red t-shirt and blue shorts. Some neighbors reported hearing children shouting, but no one recalled seeing Brian leave the playground. His absence remained unexplainable. Helicopters flew overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the surrounding neighborhoods. From above, the playground looked like an island of light in the darkness. Volunteers lined up in rows, walking shoulder to shoulder through fields and wooded areas. Others searched drainage ditches and culverts, hoping to find some trace of the missing child. Detectives documented the scene in detail. Brian's bicycle, still propped against the fence, was photographed from multiple angles. The ground nearby showed no disturbed soil, no drag marks, and no footprints that suggested a struggle. Even the sand beneath the swing set revealed nothing unusual. For investigators, the silence of the evidence was unsettling. If Brian had been taken by force, there should have been signs. If he had left on his own, there should have been a direction to follow. But there was nothing, only the stillness of the bicycle waiting for a rider who never returned. By midnight, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office called in additional resources. The FBI was notified, and a child abduction task force was established. Brian's description was broadcast across radio and television stations. 7 years old, brown hair, hazel eyes. Last seen near the neighborhood playground at approximately 3:45 p.m., parents kept their children indoors. The park, once filled with laughter, was now cordoned off with yellow tape. Officers walked the perimeter again and again, retracing the steps of witnesses. They interviewed anyone who had been at the playground that afternoon. Each account led back to the same chilling truth. Brian was there, and then he was not. The following morning, the search widened to a 2-mile radius. Bloodhounds were brought in, sniffing for a trail from the spot where the bicycle stood. The dogs picked up a faint scent, but lost it near the street, suggesting Brian may have entered a vehicle. No one, however, remembered seeing a car stop at the fence line. Detectives checked registered offenders in the area. They interviewed park employees, delivery drivers, and nearby shop owners. One lead suggested a blue pickup truck had been parked near the playground, but no clear description or license plate could be provided. The information was logged, but it did not advance the case. Meanwhile, officers set up checkpoints at roadways leading out of the city, showing Brian's photograph to passing drivers. They searched abandoned buildings, drainage tunnels, and wooded areas. Each effort ended the same way, without a trace. By the end of the second day, the frustration was clear. The investigation had generated reports, statements, and hours of manpower, but not a single piece of physical evidence. No clothing, no belongings, no signs of a struggle. The absence of clues became the most disturbing detail of all. Detectives admitted the situation was unlike most missing child cases. Children often left behind something, a shoe, a piece of torn fabric, a trail of prints. But Brian left nothing. Even the grass near his bicycle appeared undisturbed, as if time had simply stopped at that spot. For the Kelly family, those first 48 hours were unbearable. They watched as officers combed through their neighborhood, as reporters camped outside their home, as strangers handed out flyers bearing Brian's face. Every question they asked returned the same answer. No one knew where he had gone. Investigators considered every possibility. Could Brian have wandered into the woods and gotten lost? Could he have fallen into water or hidden in a nearby shed? Each theory was tested, and each one failed. No sign of Brian was found. As night fell on the second day, the case carried an eerie weight. A boy had vanished from a crowded playground in broad daylight, leaving behind only a bicycle and unanswered questions. It was as though he had been swallowed by the air itself. The disappearance of 7-year-old Brian Kelly had already shaken Jacksonville, but for the police, the pressure mounted with every passing hour. Once the frantic first 48 hours had passed with no answers, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office shifted its focus to the painstaking work of an early investigation. Detectives began with the most obvious step, retracing Brian's routine and speaking to everyone who might have seen him that evening. Neighbors recalled the familiar sight of Brian pedaling around the block, his Braves cap tilted back as the summer sun dipped below the rooftops. Yet when pressed for details about the critical moment, the time he vanished, no one could recall anything unusual. Some remembered children playing in the park. Others thought they saw Brian ride past. But the accounts blurred, times conflicted, and certainty dissolved into speculation. At Jefferson Elementary School, investigators interviewed Brian's classmates and teachers. The children described him as friendly, sometimes shy, but nothing about his behavior in the days before he disappeared suggested he was troubled. His teacher recalled that he was excited about an upcoming field trip. A friend remembered Brian had promised to bring his new baseball cards to class. These small details painted a picture of normalcy, deepening the mystery. Detectives expanded the search to the park itself. Maintenance workers were interviewed, their routines scrutinized. One groundskeeper, a man in his 40s with a criminal record for petty theft, drew immediate attention. He had been seen near the park that evening, pushing a cart of tools. Police brought him in for questioning, hoping this lead would break the case open. But after hours of interrogation, no evidence tied him to Brian's disappearance. His alibi checked out and he was released. The frustration among investigators grew. Meanwhile, reports trickled in from residents who claimed they had noticed unfamiliar faces in the neighborhood. A couple reported a man loitering near the park, smoking a cigarette and watching the children. Another resident mentioned a white van parked suspiciously on the corner. Detectives chased down every tip, but each one led nowhere. The man with the cigarette was identified as a relative visiting nearby. The van belonged to a delivery driver making his usual rounds. As the investigation stalled, the media descended on the Kelly family's quiet street. News vans lined the road. Reporters crowded the front lawn, shoving microphones toward the grieving parents. Linda Kelly's tearful plea for her son's safe return aired on every local station, amplifying the urgency. Charles stood beside her, stoic and exhausted, his eyes heavy from sleepless nights. The family's anguish became a nightly story, a tragic headline that gripped the community. Public pressure intensified. Parents in Jacksonville held their children closer, fearful that what happened to Brian could happen to theirs. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up overnight. Tips flooded the sheriff's office, overwhelming investigators with leads that went in circles. One caller swore she saw Brian at a gas station. Another claimed he was at a shopping mall. Each report raised hopes, only to end in disappointment. The sheriff's office assembled a task force, pooling officers from across the city. They re-examined the bicycle, the only piece of physical evidence. But the bike offered nothing. No fingerprints, no damage, no signs of a struggle. It was as though Brian had set it down himself and simply vanished. By the end of the first week, detectives faced a grim reality. Despite dozens of interviews, hours of surveillance checks, and hundreds of tips, they had no suspects and no answers. The case that began with urgency was now buried under a mountain of dead ends. Every lead collapsed into silence. As days turned into weeks, the disappearance of Brian Kelly transformed from a neighborhood tragedy into a citywide concern. Jacksonville, a community that once felt safe and familiar, was suddenly gripped by fear and uncertainty. Local churches organized prayer vigils, their pews filled with parents clutching photographs of their children. Candlelight flickered across faces lined with worry as voices rose together, asking for Brian's safe return. Flyers bearing his image were taped to storefront windows, pinned on bulletin boards, and handed out at gas stations. His freckled smile became impossible to miss, a reminder of a child still out there, somewhere. The Kelly family's lives changed overnight. Linda could no longer bring herself to return to her job at the dental clinic, her thoughts consumed by where her son might be. Charles dragged himself to the auto shop, but co-workers noticed his hands trembled as he tried to work. At home, Melissa, Brian's older sister, watched her parents unravel under the weight of grief. Their once ordinary household was now defined by unanswered questions and empty silence. Meanwhile, the wider community lived under a cloud of fear. Parents who once allowed their children to roam the park freely now kept them close, unwilling to take the same risk. Playgrounds emptied. The sight of a child riding a bicycle alone became rare. Jacksonville, once proud of its family-friendly neighborhoods, felt altered forever. For the Kellys, the support of neighbors provided brief comfort. But every vigil and every flyer was also a reminder that time was passing without answers. The sheriff's office gave updates when it could, but the message was always the same. The search continued. Leads were being followed, and the investigation was ongoing. Yet, with every new day, hope dimmed a little more. Despite every effort, no answers came. The investigation into Brian Kelly's disappearance soon became a maze of false trails. Every call to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office carried the possibility of hope, but most dissolved into disappointment. In the weeks that followed, several reported sightings came in. A boy matching Brian's description was said to have been spotted in a grocery store in St. Augustine, then again at a rest stop near Tallahassee. Each time, detectives mobilized quickly, dispatching patrols and interviewing witnesses. But when security footage was pulled, the child never matched Brian. The leads drained valuable hours and resources, but investigators could not afford to ignore them. Anonymous tips poured in, many pointing to suspicious vehicles. The most common detail was a van, sometimes described as white, other times dark blue, allegedly seen near the playground on the day Brian vanished. Officers combed through registration records, pulling over vehicles that fit the descriptions. Mechanics, delivery drivers, and contractors were all questioned. Yet none of the vehicles linked to anything credible. Forensic examinations turned up nothing but ordinary fingerprints and traces of dust and grease. One tip gained unusual traction when a man described seeing a drifter in the area. The man was said to be moving from park to park, carrying a backpack and sleeping under bridges. Detectives located him within days and questioned him intensely. He admitted to being near the playground on several occasions, but there was no evidence tying him to Brian. His background check revealed only minor offenses, and when his alibi held up, he was released. The local press, desperate for developments, fueled speculation. Headlines asked whether predators were lurking in Jacksonville, and talk shows debated the van sightings. With every broadcast, public anxiety deepened. Detectives, however, grew increasingly frustrated. They knew the difference between noise and evidence, but the noise was deafening. Behind closed doors, task force meetings grew tense. Hours of canvassing yielded no breakthrough. Interviews with neighbors and classmates circled back to the same point. Brian had been there, and then he was gone. His bicycle, untouched and leaning against the fence, was still the only solid clue. The family watched as momentum slowed. Vigils continued. Flyers were still handed out, but the flood of information had turned into a trickle. Hope was slipping, even among the investigators. Detectives admitted privately that they had exhausted every lead from the first wave of tips. Months passed with no significant discovery. The trail was cold and every direction turned into another dead end. By winter, the case was slipping away. The urgency that once consumed Jacksonville began to fade. In the first weeks, Brian Kelly's disappearance dominated headlines. Every broadcast carried his photograph, every paper reprinted his story. But as weeks turned into months, the story lost space. New crimes, new tragedies, and the pull of daily news cycles pushed Brian's name further from public view. By the mid-1990s, the search had slowed to a crawl. Detectives still fielded occasional tips, but most were recycled rumors. The same van, the same shadowy figures, the same uncertain sightings. Nothing advanced the investigation. The optimism of those first frantic days had drained away, replaced by long silences and unanswered questions. For the Kelly family, silence was the cruelest wound. Charles Kelly kept his son's bicycle in the garage untouched, refusing to part with it. Linda Kelly kept Brian's room as it was on that June afternoon in 1991, unwilling to accept the finality of his absence. Every birthday passed with a candle lit, but no celebration. Every Christmas came with an empty chair. Detectives cycled through the case. Some retired, others transferred, and new investigators inherited the file with little more than a stack of old reports. The thick binders filled with interviews, maps, and photographs carried the weight of failure. Detectives admitted privately that the lack of physical evidence left them with little hope. Without new information, there was nothing to test, nothing to compare, nothing to chase. As the late 1990s came, the case was mentioned less frequently in the media. Local papers might run a short article on the anniversary, but the front-page headlines were gone. Television stations no longer broadcast appeals. To the city, Brian Kelly's name was becoming a memory. The community that once rallied had moved on. Parents still remembered the fear of 1991, but by the early 2000s, new families lived in those neighborhoods. Playgrounds echoed with different voices, children who had never heard Brian's story. The tragedy had become part of Jacksonville's past, not its present. For Charles and Linda, however, time only deepened the wound. Their daily lives were marked by absence. Charles worked in silence, his energy drained by years of uncertainty. Linda avoided conversations about the future, her thoughts fixed on the boy who never came home. Their marriage strained under the weight of unanswered questions. They lived together, but grief created an invisible wall. Detectives who once carried the case in their minds admitted it had slipped into the background. Files were boxed up, labeled, and placed in storage. The shelves of the archives held dozens of unsolved cases, but Brian's file sat untouched more often than not. Each year that passed without progress made the likelihood of answers smaller. Advances in forensic science in the late 1990s and early 2000s gave some families hope. But for the Kellys, there was no evidence to test. No fingerprints, no fibers, no DNA. The bicycle, once considered the key to the mystery, revealed nothing new under repeated analysis. Every anniversary marked another year of silence. Linda Kelly would write letters to the police department, pleading for updates, but the responses were always the same. There was nothing new to share. Charles withdrew further, his grief expressed in quiet hours alone. By the early 2000s, Brian's disappearance was rarely mentioned outside of his family. Jacksonville had grown, new crimes demanded attention, and the city's memory moved forward. The Kellys, however, remained frozen in June 1991. For detectives, the cold case symbolized frustration. Some spoke of it during training sessions for younger officers, a reminder that not every case finds closure. The details were always the same. A child vanished from a playground in broad daylight, leaving behind no trace. The sheer absence of evidence haunted even the most experienced investigators. Time became the greatest obstacle. Witnesses who once remembered details began to doubt their own memories. Addresses changed, phone numbers disconnected, and leads that once seemed promising grew impossible to trace. The silence of the case became heavier with each passing year. By 2005, 14 years had passed. The Kellys no longer expected their phone to ring with news. They had learned to live with the weight of uncertainty, but the pain never lessened. Each day was a reminder of what had been taken and what had never been answered. 17 years after Brian Kelly vanished, the case remained unsolved. His photograph, once everywhere, now existed only in fading newspaper clippings and a few aging flyers. For 17 years, the case gathered dust in the archive. In 2008, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office created a small cold case unit dedicated to reopening old files. Among the dozens of forgotten cases stacked in storage, Brian Kelly's file stood out. A child gone without a trace, a case that had haunted detectives for 17 years. The unit began by reviewing every item preserved from 1991. Most were photographs, statements and reports already studied countless times. But in one sealed evidence box was Brian's shirt, carefully stored despite never yielding results. In 1991, testing methods had been limited. No usable DNA profile had been found. 17 years later, science had advanced. Laboratories could now extract partial profiles from samples once thought too degraded. The cold case detectives authorized new testing, sending Brian's shirt to the state crime lab. The fabric was carefully re-examined under modern protocols, with every fiber inspected for potential biological material. Weeks passed before the results arrived. Analysts confirmed the presence of a partial DNA profile, faint but clear enough to be compared against CODIS, the national database of offenders. When the entry was submitted, the system produced a hit. The match was not complete, but it was strong enough to draw immediate attention. It pointed to an offender with a sealed juvenile record, someone whose crimes as a minor had been locked away from public view. Detectives understood the implications. Juvenile records were rarely linked to violent crimes of this nature. If the system produced a match, it meant the offender's history was darker than anyone had realized. The discovery shocked the unit. After years of silence, there was finally a concrete lead. They pulled the files, traced the sealed record, and began piecing together the name hidden behind the hit. For detectives who had only read the case in old reports, the moment carried enormous weight. For the Kelly family, still living with absence, it was the first sign of movement in nearly 2 decades. But questions swirled. Why had this offender's record been sealed? How had he slipped through the cracks for so long? And most importantly, could the DNA truly connect him to Brian Kelly on that summer day in 1991? Detectives braced themselves. The name behind the match stunned investigators. Detective Maria Lopez joined the Jacksonville Cold Case Unit in 2007. She was younger than many of the veterans, but her reputation was already clear. She was methodical, relentless, and unwilling to accept loose ends. When Brian Kelly's file landed on her desk, she did not see just an old investigation. She saw a challenge and perhaps a chance for long-delayed justice. The DNA hit from Brian's shirt was enough to reignite the case, but Lopez knew it was only a starting point. The partial profile linked to a sealed juvenile record offered no immediate answers. Court protections kept details hidden, and legal hurdles made every step slow. Still, she pressed forward. Her first move was to study the original witness statements again. She read every line, highlighting overlooked details, searching for inconsistencies. Neighbors who described seeing unfamiliar vehicles. Children who mentioned strangers on the playground. Maintenance workers who had been questioned and released. None of it had led anywhere in 1991, but Lopez believed the context of DNA evidence changed everything. She drove to the playground where Brian had last been seen. 17 years had passed, but the park remained. The swings were newer. The fence had been replaced, yet Lopez stood there picturing the bicycle leaning untouched against the chain links. She retraced the boy's last known steps in silence, trying to imagine how a predator could have moved so quickly and without notice. Back at the station, she constructed a profile. The offender would not have been a transient drifter, she reasoned. The speed of the abduction suggested knowledge of the area. A person confident enough to act in daylight. Combined with the DNA link to a sealed juvenile record, Lopez began to focus on someone who had lived close by in 1991. Her persistence became consuming. Colleagues noticed her late nights, the files spread across her desk, the steady rhythm of her pen on legal pads filled with theories. She cross-referenced school rosters, juvenile arrests in the neighborhood, and employment logs of park workers. Every thread was tested against the faint DNA hit. The deeper she went, the clearer the path became. The juvenile record pointed to someone whose past behavior had been hidden under legal protections. A person once considered a troubled youth, not a violent predator. But the science told a different story. Detective Maria Lopez refused to let the case fade again. Step by step, she peeled away layers of secrecy that had shielded the truth for years. Each lead that had once collapsed now seemed to converge toward a single possibility. Her search pointed back to someone who had once lived just blocks away. The DNA profile, faint but undeniable, pointed to a name: Daniel Harper. He was 42 years old in 2008, but in the summer of 1991, he had been a 17-year-old living only 3 blocks from the playground where Brian Kelly vanished. Harper's juvenile record, sealed for decades, had included theft, truancy, and violent outbursts at school. He had been known as a troubled teenager, drifting between relatives' homes after repeated conflicts with his parents. None of this had surfaced in the original investigation, and with the protections of juvenile court, his history had remained hidden from public view. Detective Maria Lopez assembled a timeline. In June 1991, Harper had no stable job, no regular supervision, and a reputation for lingering around the neighborhood unsupervised. His proximity to the playground, combined with the DNA recovered from Brian's shirt, created a picture that was impossible to ignore. Investigators began quiet surveillance. Harper now worked as a mechanic on the outskirts of Jacksonville, living a modest life in a rented home. He had no violent convictions as an adult, only minor offenses that blended into the background of ordinary police records. To his neighbors, he appeared unremarkable, just another man who kept to himself, but detectives saw the gap between appearances and truth. They gathered old witness statements again, this time under the lens of Harper's presence. A teenager seen near the playground fence, a figure loitering by the bicycle racks. Descriptions once dismissed as vague suddenly fit a face and a name. Police moved cautiously, preparing for an interview that would test years of silence. When Harper was called in, he appeared calm, even curious about why detectives had reached out after so long. The questions began slowly, about his life in 1991, about where he had been that summer, about whether he had ever visited the playground. As the hours passed, Lopez shifted the conversation. She presented the DNA results. She explained how Brian's shirt, preserved for nearly 2 decades, had spoken in ways Harper never expected. The confidence drained from his posture. He denied at first, insisting the science must be flawed. But the evidence was steady, the questions relentless. Detectives showed him the photographs of Brian, the reports of that day, the bicycle leaning untouched against the fence. Piece by piece, they stripped away his defenses. Harper's answers faltered, contradictions crept in, and silence began to fill the room. Then, under the weight of 17 years of buried truth, he confessed. His voice was low, detached, as if recounting a memory sealed in a box he had hoped would never be opened. He admitted he had approached Brian at the playground, offering to show him something nearby. The boy trusted him, followed him only a short distance, and never returned. Harper described leading Brian toward an abandoned drainage area not far from the park. Panic took over when Brian resisted, when the situation spiraled beyond control. In chilling detail, he admitted to killing the child and hiding the body in a place he believed would never be found. The confession was clinical, stripped of remorse but devastating in its clarity. Detectives listened, recording every word. The missing pieces of a mystery that had haunted Jacksonville for nearly 2 decades were suddenly laid bare. Harper provided details only the perpetrator could have known, details that matched the timeline and evidence preserved since 1991. The interview ended with a room heavy in silence. Officers knew they had the truth at last, but it was a truth no one wanted to hear. After years of vigils, searches, and unanswered prayers, the story had found its conclusion in the most brutal of ways. Daniel Harper was charged with Brian Kelly's murder. For the Kelly family, the confession tore open wounds that had never healed. Yet for investigators, it was the moment they had pursued through decades of frustration and false hope. After 17 years, the day after Daniel Harper's confession, detectives moved swiftly. He was arrested at his small rental home, handcuffed on the front porch as stunned neighbors watched. For years, he had lived quietly among them, fixing cars and keeping to himself. Few could imagine that the man they greeted in passing carried such a secret. The news spread quickly across Jacksonville. A name unknown to most residents now filled headlines. The boy who had disappeared from a playground in 1991 was no longer just a mystery. His killer had been identified, arrested, and charged with first-degree murder. For the Kelly family, the arrest reopened wounds that had never fully closed. Linda and Charles Kelly walked into the courthouse together for the arraignment, holding hands as reporters shouted questions they could not answer. Their faces, lined with 17 years of pain, became symbols of both tragedy and resilience. The trial that followed drew intense attention. Prosecutors presented Harper's confession, the DNA evidence from Brian's shirt, and the details of his troubled youth. Witnesses described the original search, the years of silence, and the moment when the case was revived through modern science. The courtroom became a place where decades of uncertainty were finally given a voice. For the Kellys, sitting through testimony was unbearable. They listened to the words they had dreaded for nearly 2 decades. How their son was lured away, how his life was ended, how his body was hidden in a forgotten drainage area. Each detail reopened the day they had lost him, but they remained in the courtroom, determined to see justice through. Jacksonville reacted with a mix of relief and disbelief. Residents who had raised children in the same neighborhoods expressed shock that the killer had once lived among them. Some remembered Harper as a troubled teen who seemed aimless, but none had imagined his involvement in one of the city's darkest crimes. Churches held new vigils, this time in honor of Brian's memory rather than in hope for his return. The defense attempted to argue Harper's unstable upbringing, his mental health struggles, and the fact that he had lived quietly as an adult. But the jury saw the evidence differently. The DNA match, the confession, and the timeline built an unshakable case. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Daniel Harper was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed little reaction as deputies escorted him away, his fate sealed after nearly 2 decades of evading justice. For the Kelly family, the sentence was both an ending and a reminder. They would never see Brian again, but they had finally heard the truth spoken in court. His name would no longer rest in a file marked unsolved. Instead, his story had been given closure, though the cost was immeasurable. Justice had come, but at a devastating cost. The resolution of Brian Kelly's case was not the product of a sudden breakthrough or a single witness stepping forward. It came through the quiet, methodical persistence of investigators and the steady advancement of technology. What once eluded human memory and faded recollections was eventually uncovered by science. A trace of DNA, preserved for years, carrying the truth that no one could deny. In Jacksonville, the case became more than a solved crime. It stood as a reminder of how fragile justice can be, how long answers may remain hidden, and how deeply a community can carry grief. Families raised their children under the shadow of Brian's disappearance, teaching caution, speaking his name, and hoping for safety that often felt uncertain. For many, the arrest of Daniel Harper was both a relief and a warning. Evil can live quietly, undetected, until the smallest fragment of evidence brings it into the light. The Kelly family would never be the same. They had lived through years of false hopes, empty birthdays, and an absence that could never be filled. Sitting through the trial brought them answers, but it also forced them to relive the pain in detail. They left the courthouse knowing that their son's story had reached its end, yet also knowing that no verdict could return what had been taken. For investigators, the case reaffirmed the value of patience and persistence. Each box of evidence stored in a warehouse carried a chance for closure no matter how much time had passed. In Brian's case, that chance was realized, but the truth arrived slowly, after 17 years of silence. The story remains one of Jacksonville's darkest tragedies, not only for the crime itself but for the long years of uncertainty that followed. It is remembered with solemnity, not triumph. The conviction closed the case, but it could never erase the absence that defined the Kelly family's life. 17 years later, the silence was broken, but the loss could never be undone.